The leather trunk sat buried beneath years of hay dust and forgotten tools in the old barn outside Wilson, Wyoming, where Ethan Keller had been working odd jobs since arriving 2 weeks before in late February of 1882. He had not planned to stay long in this small cattle town nestled in the shadow of the Teton Range, but winter had been harsh and his money had run thin. So when the livery owner offered him room and board in exchange for mucking stalls and repairing tack, he accepted without hesitation. The work was honest if unglamorous, and it gave him time to think about where his life was headed now that he had turned 24 and still had no real direction beyond the next town, the next job, the next sunrise. On this particular afternoon, with March winds howling outside and rattling the barn doors, Ethan had been tasked with clearing out the old storage loft. The livery owner, a grizzled man named Thompson who had owned the place for 30 years, said there might be some salvageable equipment up there from the previous owners. Ethan climbed the rickety ladder and began sorting through the debris of other people's lives. Rusted horseshoes and cracked saddles and wooden crates filled with nothing but mouse droppings. Then he saw it, pushed far back into the corner where the roof slanted down to meet the floor, a trunk covered in dust so thick it looked like gray velvet. He dragged it into better light, noting the brass corners and the leather straps that had gone brittle with age. The lock had rusted through, and when he pulled on the lid, it opened with a groan that seemed to echo his own curiosity. Inside, wrapped in faded calico fabric, was a small leather-bound diary. Ethan lifted it carefully, surprised by how well preserved it was despite the trunk's neglect. The cover was plain brown leather, soft and worn from handling, and when he opened it, the pages released the faint smell of lavender and old ink. The first entry was dated April 15, 1878, nearly 4 years earlier. The handwriting was careful and elegant, clearly belonging to someone educated and thoughtful. Ethan had not intended to pry into private thoughts, but something about the first line caught his attention and would not let go. Today I turn 18, and I am more alone than I have ever been in my life, but I refuse to let that break me. Ethan sat down on the dusty floor of the loft and began to read. The author was a young woman named Adelaide Morgan, and she wrote of arriving in Wyoming territory with her father, a surveyor who had been hired to map routes for potential railroad expansion. Her mother had died 2 years before from pneumonia, and it was just Adelaide and her father traveling from one remote location to another. She wrote about the landscape with such vivid detail that Ethan could see it through her eyes. The way the mountains turned purple at sunset, the wildflowers that carpeted the meadows in summer, the sound of elk bugling in the autumn dusk. But she also wrote about loneliness, about missing the friends she had left behind in Philadelphia, about the difficulty of being a young woman in rough country where towns were few and civilization even more scarce. She wrote about her father's dedication to his work, but also his increasing distance from her, as though losing his wife had hollowed him out, and he no longer knew how to connect with his daughter. She wrote about her dreams of becoming a teacher, of opening a school for children in these frontier settlements who had no access to education. Ethan found himself completely absorbed in her words. There was intelligence and humor in her observations, compassion and strength in how she described helping injured animals or befriending the lonely wives of ranchers they encountered. She had a way of noticing details that most people overlooked, the way a particular bird sang at dawn, the pattern of frost on a window pane, the expression in an old horse's eyes. She was philosophical without being pretentious, wondering about her place in the world and what her life might become while still remaining grounded in the practical realities of frontier existence. The entries continued through that spring and summer. She wrote about learning to cook over an open fire, about mending clothes until they were more patch than original fabric, about reading the same 3 books she owned over and over because there were no others available. She wrote about a near encounter with a bear that terrified her, about a terrible storm that destroyed their camp and forced them to take shelter in a cave for 2 days, about the kindness of strangers who shared their food when supplies ran low. Then the tone shifted. In August, her father became ill. At first she thought it was just exhaustion from long days in the sun, but it grew worse. Fever, chills, weakness that would not abate. She nursed him as best she could with her limited knowledge, but they were days from any town, and by the time they reached a settlement with a doctor, it was too late. Her father died on August 23, 1878, and Adelaide's world fell apart. The entries after that were heartbreaking. She wrote about the funeral, about selling her father's surveying equipment to pay for his burial and her immediate expenses, about the crushing realization that she was now entirely alone in the world with no family and almost no money. She had been staying with a kind widow in a town she did not name, doing laundry and mending to earn her keep, but she knew she could not impose forever. She wrote about her fear and grief, but also about her determination not to give up on the dreams she had for her life. The last entry was dated October 30, 1878. Adelaide wrote that she had accepted a position as a governess for a ranching family about 40 miles north, teaching their 3 children in exchange for room and board and a small salary. She was nervous but hopeful. She wrote, "I must believe that my life still has purpose and meaning, even though everything I knew has been taken from me. I must believe that somewhere ahead there is happiness waiting, that this is not all there is. I will carry my dreams with me, and perhaps someday they will come true." If whoever finds this diary is reading these words, know that Adelaide Morgan did not surrender. She kept going, no matter how hard the path became. And that was where it ended. No more entries, no indication of what happened next or where she went or whether she ever achieved those dreams. Ethan sat in the fading afternoon light with the diary closed in his hands, feeling as though he had been punched in the chest. This woman, this Adelaide, had poured her heart onto these pages nearly 4 years ago, and now her words had found their way to him through time and chance. He felt connected to her in a way he could not explain, as though reading her intimate thoughts had created a bond that transcended the years between her writing and his reading. He thought about her throughout the evening as he finished his chores, fed the horses, locked up the barn. Over dinner at the boarding house where he rented a small room, he barely tasted his food. The other boarders talked and laughed around him, but he was lost in his own thoughts, wondering about Adelaide Morgan. Was she still alive? Had she remained in Wyoming or returned east? Had she found work that fulfilled her? Had she found love? Had she found peace after the trauma of losing her father? The questions plagued him through a restless night. By morning, he had made a decision that surprised him with its intensity. He was going to find her. He was going to track down Adelaide Morgan and return her diary to her. And somehow, in some way he did not yet understand, he felt this was the most important thing he had ever been called to do. Thompson raised his eyebrows when Ethan asked for time away from his work, but he was a fair man and agreed that Ethan had earned a few days. When Ethan explained about finding the diary and his intention to locate its author, Thompson scratched his grizzled chin and considered. "That trunk belonged to the family that owned this livery before me," Thompson said. "Name was Patterson. They sold out and moved back to St. Louis about 5 years back." Don't know why they left that trunk behind, but it was here when I bought the place, and I just never got around to dealing with it. If there's a diary from some woman, it must have gotten mixed in with their things somehow. Can't help you much beyond that." Ethan thanked him and headed to the general store, where the proprietor's wife was known as the unofficial keeper of Wilson's history and gossip. Mrs. Henderson was a round, cheerful woman who loved nothing better than a good story, and she listened with growing interest as Ethan explained his quest. "Adelaide Morgan," she repeated thoughtfully. "Morgan. I do not recall anyone by that name living here in Wilson, but the territory is large and people come and go. If she was working as a governess 40 miles north from wherever she was in October of 1878, that could be almost anywhere depending on her starting point." "Do you know what town she was in when she wrote that last entry?" "She never named it," Ethan said. "But her father was a surveyor and he died in late August that year. There might be records, death certificates, or burial records." Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking, young man. You will want to check with the territorial offices in Cheyenne, but that is a long journey. Closer would be to ask around at the churches. Pastors keep records of burials, and if her father died anywhere in this region, someone might remember. It was only 4 years ago, after all." Ethan spent the rest of that day and the next visiting the 3 churches in Wilson, but none of the pastors recalled a surveyor named Morgan dying in 1878. They suggested he expand his search to neighboring towns. With Thompson's permission, Ethan borrowed a horse and began a circuit of the settlements within a day's ride. He went to Jackson to the north, to Pine Creek to the east, to smaller, unnamed clusters of ranches and homesteads where people gathered at trading posts and way stations. It was slow, frustrating work. Most people had never heard of Adelaide or her father. A few remembered hearing about a surveyor who died a few years back, but could not recall the name or exact location. Ethan began to worry that his quest was foolish, that Adelaide might have left Wyoming entirely, that he was chasing a ghost who existed only in the pages of an old diary. But something stubborn in him refused to give up. Every time he considered abandoning the search, he would open the diary and read another entry, and Adelaide's voice would pull him forward. After a week of searching, he found his first solid lead in a tiny settlement called Riverside, barely more than a dozen buildings clustered around a ferry crossing. The elderly man who ran the ferry, bent with age but sharp-minded, listened to Ethan's description and then nodded slowly. "Morgan, yes, I remember. Thin fellow, had surveying equipment, came through here summer of 78 with his daughter. Nice girl, polite. They crossed going north, and then about a month later she came back alone. Said her father had passed. She was with some widow woman. I think they were heading south. Sad business." "Do you remember the widow's name?" Ethan asked, his heart pounding. The old man shook his head. "Too many years, too many people, but I recall they were heading toward Lander. The widow had family there, I believe, or maybe it was just the closest place with a proper store. Can't say for certain." Lander was 2 days' hard ride to the southeast. Ethan thanked the ferryman and immediately began provisioning for the journey. Thompson was less pleased about extending Ethan's absence, but agreed when Ethan promised to return as soon as his search concluded, successful or not. The truth was, Ethan no longer cared much about the job at the livery. Something had awakened in him through reading Adelaide's diary, a sense of purpose and direction he had never felt before. Whatever his life had been wandering aimlessly from place to place, it felt now like all of it had been leading him to that dusty trunk and those written pages. The ride to Lander took him through country that Adelaide had described in her diary, and he found himself seeing it through her eyes. noticing the details she would have noticed. The way sunlight filtered through the cottonwoods, the tracks of deer in the mud near a creek, the endless sweep of sagebrush giving way to pine-covered hills. He camped at night under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, and he read passages from the diary by firelight, feeling her presence in the words as though she sat across the flames from him. Lander, in March of 1882, was a bustling town by Wyoming standards, with perhaps 200 permanent residents and all the services and businesses that came with being a regional supply hub. Ethan arrived dusty and tired, stabled his horse, and immediately began asking questions. The local newspaper office seemed like a logical starting point, and the editor, a precise man with ink-stained fingers, consulted his back files when Ethan explained what he was looking for. August 1878, death of a surveyor named Morgan, the editor muttered, flipping through old editions. Here, yes. Notice of death, brief obituary. Says he was survived by his daughter Adelaide. Services held at the Methodist Church. Does not list her current whereabouts, but if the services were here then she must have been in town at that time. Armed with this confirmation, Ethan went to the Methodist Church. The current pastor had only been there 2 years, but he directed Ethan to one of the church elders, a woman named Mrs. Crawford who had lived in Lander for decades. She was a dignified woman in her 60s, and when Ethan explained his search she regarded him with keen interest. "I remember Adelaide Morgan," Mrs. Crawford said. "Sweet girl, devastated by her father's death. She stayed with Helen Pritchard for several weeks, doing odd work to earn her keep. Helen was a widow herself and took pity on the girl. They got on well, as I recall. Then Adelaide received an offer of employment from the Hendricks family, big ranchers north of here. She left town to work as their governess. That must have been late October, yes, about the time you mentioned." "Do you know if she is still with the Hendricks family?" Ethan asked, scarcely daring to hope. Mrs. Crawford shook her head. "The Hendricks sold their ranch about 2 years ago and moved to California. I heard the daughter had married and they wanted to be near grandchildren. I do not know what became of Adelaide after that. She might have gone with them or found other employment. Have you tried asking at the schoolhouse? Adelaide spoke several times about her desire to teach, and I know the territorial board was desperate for teachers even then." Ethan practically ran to the schoolhouse, a neat frame building at the edge of town. School was in session, and through the windows he could see a woman standing at the front of the classroom, gesturing as she explained something written on the blackboard. His heart leaped into his throat. Could it possibly be her? But when the woman turned, he saw she was older, perhaps 40, and when he inquired, she introduced herself as Miss Thornton and explained she had been teaching in Lander for 6 years. "But I did hear of an Adelaide Morgan," Miss Thornton said when Ethan explained his search. "She applied for a teaching position here about 1.5 years ago, but the position was already filled. I believe she took work at a school in Centennial instead. That is down near the Medicine Bow Mountains, southeast from here near the Colorado border. It is quite a journey, but if you are determined to find her, that would be where I would suggest looking next." Ethan left Lander the next morning with fresh supplies and renewed determination. Centennial was another 3 days of travel, and the landscape changed as he rode south and east, the high peaks giving way to rolling hills and vast expanses of grassland broken by rocky outcroppings. The wind was constant, cold and searching, but spring was beginning to assert itself in small ways, early wildflowers pushing up through the brown grass, migratory birds returning from southern journeys. He thought constantly about what he would say when he finally found Adelaide if he found her. The whole quest seemed increasingly absurd when he examined it rationally. He was tracking down a woman he had never met based on a diary she had written 4 years ago, with the intention of doing what exactly? Returning her private writings to her, yes, but also what? He was not foolish enough to pretend he did not feel something deeper pulling him forward. He had fallen half in love with the Adelaide in those pages, with her courage and intelligence, and the way she found beauty in harsh places. But that Adelaide was 4 years younger than the woman who existed now, if she existed at all. People changed. The woman he found might bear little resemblance to the girl who had penned those heartfelt entries, yet he could not turn back. Something about this felt like destiny, like his entire aimless life had been preparation for this one purposeful journey. Centennial was smaller than Lander, a mining and ranching community of perhaps 75 souls clustered in a mountain valley of stunning beauty. Ethan arrived on a Saturday afternoon, and his first stop was the general store where he knew he would find someone willing to talk. The storekeeper was a friendly man named Mr. Dalton who confirmed that, yes, there was indeed a schoolteacher named Adelaide Morgan. "Been here about 1.5 years," Dalton said. "Nice young woman, lives in a little cabin behind the schoolhouse. Good teacher from what I hear, the children like her. Keeps mostly to herself otherwise, but pleasant enough when she comes in for supplies. You will find the schoolhouse at the north end of town, past the assay office." Ethan thanked him and walked slowly through the town, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. This was it. After all the searching, all the miles, he was about to meet Adelaide Morgan. The diary felt heavy in his coat pocket, a tangible connection to the woman who had written it. He rehearsed a dozen different greetings in his mind, trying to find words that would not sound insane. How did you explain to a stranger that you had read her most private thoughts and felt compelled to track her across Wyoming to return them? The schoolhouse was easy to spot, a simple structure with a bell tower and a small fenced yard. Behind it, connected by a covered walkway, was a tiny cabin that must serve as the teacher's residence. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was home. Ethan stood outside the gate for a long moment, gathering his courage. Then he walked up the path and knocked on the cabin door. The woman who opened it took his breath away. She was not beautiful in any conventional sense, her features too strong for that, her figure too slender. But there was something luminous about her, an intelligence in her gray eyes and a warmth in her expression that made him understand immediately why children would love having her as a teacher. Her dark hair was pinned up loosely, and she wore a simple blue dress with a white apron over it. She looked at him with polite curiosity, clearly wondering who this dusty stranger on her doorstep might be. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice clear and pleasant. Ethan removed his hat. "Miss Adelaide Morgan." "Yes, that is correct." A hint of wariness entered her expression, the natural caution of a woman living alone when confronted by an unknown man. "My name is Ethan Keller. I realize this will sound strange, but I have traveled from Wilson to find you. I have something that belongs to you, and I thought you might want it back." Adelaide's brow furrowed in confusion. "I do not believe we have met before, Mr. Keller, and I cannot imagine what possession of mine you might have. I own very little, and I certainly left nothing behind in Wilson. I have never even been there." Ethan reached into his coat and withdrew the diary, holding it carefully. "I found this in an old trunk in a barn. After I read it, and I apologize for that invasion of privacy, but I did not know what it was until I had already begun. I knew I had to find you and return it." Adelaide stared at the diary, her face going pale. She reached out slowly and took it from his hands, opening it to the first page as though she could not quite believe it was real. Her eyes scanned her own handwriting from 4 years past, and when she looked up at him again, her expression was a complicated mixture of emotions. "Where did you say you found this?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "In Wilson, in a trunk in a barn at the livery. It must have gotten mixed in with someone else's belongings." I know I had no right to read it, but once I started I could not stop, and then when I reached the end I had to know what happened to you. "I have been searching for 3 weeks." "You have been searching for 3 weeks," Adelaide repeated slowly, as though testing whether the words made sense. "For me, a stranger, because you read my diary." "I know how it sounds," Ethan said, "but your words, they meant something to me. You meant something to me even though we have never met. I had to know that you were all right, that you had survived everything you wrote about, that you had found some of what you were looking for." Adelaide studied him for a long moment, and Ethan felt as though she was seeing far deeper than his surface, reading him the way he had read her diary. Finally, she stepped back from the door. "You had better come inside, Mr. Keller. This is not a conversation for a doorstep." The cabin was small but immaculately kept, with a stove for heat and cooking, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and teaching supplies. Adelaide gestured for Ethan to sit, then put a kettle on for tea. Her hands shook slightly as she moved through the familiar motions, and Ethan could see she was struggling to process this unexpected intrusion into her carefully ordered life. When she finally sat across from him, cradling a cup of tea between her palms, she said, "I thought this was lost forever. After my father died, everything was such chaos. I was staying with Mrs. Pritchard in Lander, and I remember packing what few belongings I had when I left to work for the Hendricks family. The diary must have gotten mixed in with some things Mrs. Pritchard was donating or selling. I missed it terribly at first, but eventually I accepted it was gone. And honestly, part of me was relieved. Those memories, that grief, it was so raw. Maybe it was better to leave it behind." "I am sorry," Ethan said quietly. "I should not have read it, and maybe I should not have come here. This whole thing was selfish on my part, intruding on your life because of feelings that are entirely one-sided and based on words you wrote when you were 18 and grieving. I will leave the diary with you and go. I just wanted to make sure you were all right." Adelaide looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You rode for 3 weeks across Wyoming because you wanted to make sure I was all right." "Yes. That is perhaps the most extraordinary thing anyone has ever done for me," she said softly. "Foolish, perhaps, but extraordinary." "And you say you read all of it?" "Everything I wrote." Ethan nodded. "Every entry multiple times. You have a gift for words, Adelaide. The way you describe things, the way you worked through your grief and fear but never gave up on your dreams, it moved me profoundly. I felt like I knew you, like I understood you. And I realize how arrogant that sounds, claiming to know someone from their diary, but that is the truth of it." Adelaide was quiet for a moment, sipping her tea. Then she said, "Tell me about yourself, Ethan Keller. If you know my story from 4 years ago, it seems only fair that I learn something of yours." So Ethan told her. He spoke of growing up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who drank too much and a mother who died when he was 16. He spoke of leaving home at 18 to escape his father's violence, of drifting from town to town and job to job, never quite finding a place where he fit. He spoke honestly about his own loneliness, about feeling like he was always on the outside of life looking in, about wondering if he would spend his whole existence as a temporary fixture in other people's stories, rather than the protagonist of his own. Adelaide listened with the same focused attention she probably gave her students, and when he finished she said, "So we are both wanderers in our own ways. I thought finding a teaching position would give me roots, a sense of purpose and belonging. and it has, to some degree. I love the children and I love teaching, but I am still very much alone. The other residents of Centennial are kind, but they have their own families, their own concerns. I am the school teacher, somewhat apart from the regular flow of community life. I have friends, but not intimates. My diary was my intimate in a way, the place where I could be completely honest about my thoughts and feelings. I am honored that you trust me enough to share this time with me now, Ethan said. Honestly, I did not think beyond finding you and returning the diary. I did not let myself imagine what might happen after that. Adelaide smiled, and it transformed her face, making her genuinely beautiful. Well, you have ridden for 3 weeks to get here. The least I can do is offer you supper. And perhaps you could stay a day or two, rest your horse, rest yourself. There is a boarding house in town that rents rooms, if you want to, that is, if you do not have to rush back to Wilson. I have nowhere I need to be, Ethan said, his heart lifting. Supper would be wonderful. And I would like very much to stay a few days, if you are certain you do not mind. I do not mind at all, Adelaide said, and the warmth in her voice told him she meant it. That evening felt like the beginning of something Ethan could not quite name but desperately wanted to understand. Adelaide proved to be an excellent cook, despite the limited supplies available in Centennial. Making a venison stew with root vegetables and fresh bread she had baked that morning. As they ate, they talked, and the conversation flowed as easily as if they had known each other for years rather than hours. Adelaide wanted to know everything about the places Ethan had been, the things he had seen, and she listened with genuine fascination as he described dusty cattle drives and silver mining camps and the vast empty spaces of the frontier. In turn, she told him about her 1.5 years in Centennial, the challenges of teaching children ranging from 6 to 14 in a single room, the satisfaction of watching a student master something difficult, the quiet pleasure of her small garden behind the cabin where she grew herbs and vegetables in season. She spoke about the books she had managed to acquire, forming a small lending library for the town, since the nearest actual library was days away. She spoke about her continuing dream of one day establishing a real school, with multiple rooms and several teachers, and a curriculum that would prepare frontier children for whatever futures they chose. Ethan found himself captivated not just by what she said, but by the way she said it. The animation in her face when she discussed something she cared about, the thoughtful pauses when she considered a question carefully before answering. This was the Adelaide from the diary grown into full adulthood, still carrying that core of strength and optimism, but tempered now by experience and maturity. She was 22 now, only 2 years younger than him, and he could see in her a partner rather than someone to protect or rescue. She had rescued herself. When the evening grew late and Ethan stood to leave, Adelaide walked him to the door. "Thank you for bringing my diary back," she said. "And thank you for caring enough about a stranger to track her down. That took courage, and I appreciate it more than I can easily express. Thank you for not thinking I was insane and sending me away," Ethan replied with a smile. "I will see you tomorrow. I have school during the week, but you are welcome to visit in the afternoon when lessons end. Or you could attend church with me on Sunday if you would like to meet more of the community." "I would like that very much," Ethan said. He walked back through the quiet town to the boarding house, his mind whirling. He had found her. Adelaide Morgan was real, alive, thriving in her own way. And unless he was badly misreading the situation, she was not entirely displeased by his sudden appearance in her life. The possibility that had seemed so remote when he first set out now began to feel tangible. Maybe this was not just about returning a diary. Maybe this was about two lonely people finding each other against improbable odds. The next few days fell into a pattern that felt both natural and extraordinary. Ethan spent his mornings exploring the area around Centennial, sometimes helping out at the livery stable or doing odd repairs for townspeople who quickly discovered he was handy with tools. Word spread that he was the man who had tracked down Miss Morgan to return her property, and this eccentric romantic gesture earned him considerable goodwill and curiosity. Several people went out of their way to invite him to dinner or simply to talk, and Ethan found himself enjoying the sense of community that had always eluded him in his wandering life. But the afternoons belonged to Adelaide. After school ended and her students scattered to their various homes and chores, Ethan would walk to the schoolhouse, and they would spend hours together. Sometimes they walked the trails around town, Adelaide pointing out plants and geological features with the enthusiasm of someone who had fallen in love with this landscape. Sometimes they sat in her cabin and talked, covering an endless range of topics from literature to politics to philosophy to simple daily observations. Adelaide lent him books from her collection, and they discussed them, discovering they shared similar tastes and values even when they disagreed on particulars. Ethan found himself opening up to her in ways he never had with anyone else. Perhaps because she had been so vulnerable in her diary, he felt safe being equally vulnerable in person. He told her about the shame he felt over his father's alcoholism, about the guilt that haunted him for leaving his younger sister behind though she had begged him to take her with him. Adelaide listened without judgment, and when he finished, she took his hand and said, "You were 18 and running for your own survival. That does not make you responsible for everything that came after. Your sister would not want you to carry that guilt forever." "How can you know that?" Ethan asked. "Because I know what it feels like to lose someone you love," Adelaide said quietly. "And I know that my father, for all his flaws and his distance after my mother died, would not want me to spend my life paralyzed by grief and regret. He would want me to be happy. Your sister probably wants the same for you." It was a simple statement, but it cracked something open inside Ethan that had been locked tight for years. He found his eyes burning with tears, and when Adelaide put her arms around him in a comforting embrace, he let himself cry for the first time since leaving Missouri. She held him without speaking, offering the gift of her presence and understanding, and when he finally pulled back and apologized, she shook her head firmly. "Do not apologize for being human," she said. "I spent months crying after my father died. Grief is not weakness, Ethan. It is love with nowhere to go." After that conversation, something shifted between them. The growing friendship deepened into something more intimate, a connection that went beyond words. Ethan caught himself watching Adelaide when she was not looking, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the small smile that appeared when she was lost in thought. He noticed the way she looked at him too, with an expression that made his heart race and his palms sweat. On Sunday, they attended church together, and Ethan felt the speculative gazes of the entire congregation. After the service, he was introduced to what felt like every resident of Centennial, all of them clearly curious about the stranger who had come courting their schoolteacher. Because that was what he was doing, he realized. He was courting Adelaide Morgan, even though neither of them had said as much aloud. That afternoon, they walked up into the hills above town, following a trail Adelaide said led to a beautiful overlook. The day was clear and surprisingly warm for early March, and they shed their coats as they climbed. When they reached the viewpoint, the vista took Ethan's breath away. The valley spread below them, the town a tiny collection of buildings, the mountains rising in the distance still snow-capped and magnificent. "This is where I come when I need to think," Adelaide said. "Or when I need to remember how big the world is, how much beauty there is even in difficult times." "It is extraordinary," Ethan agreed. Then, gathering his courage, he added, "but not as extraordinary as you." Adelaide turned to look at him, her gray eyes searching his face. "Ethan, I know I have no right," he said quickly. "I know I arrived here as a stranger with nothing to offer, no prospects, no real future. But Adelaide, these past days with you have been the happiest of my life. You are everything I thought you were from reading your diary and so much more. You are brilliant and compassionate and strong and beautiful, and I am falling in love with you. I have been falling in love with you since I read that first entry, but now that I know the real you, it is so much more than I imagined." Adelaide's eyes had gone very wide, and for a terrible moment, Ethan thought he had ruined everything by speaking too soon. But then she smiled, that transformative smile that lit up her entire face, and she said, "You are not the only one falling, Ethan Keller. I did not expect this. When you showed up at my door, I thought you were at best a kind eccentric and at worst a dangerous obsessive. But you are neither. You are thoughtful and honest, and you see me, really see me, in a way no one else ever has. And yes, I am falling in love with you too." Ethan felt as though he could fly. He reached out and took her hands, and she stepped closer, and then they were kissing, a gentle, tentative meeting of lips that sent electricity through his entire body. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless and grinning like fools. "So what do we do now?" Adelaide asked. "I have my teaching position here and you have your job in Wilson. That is days of travel between us." "I do not want to leave," Ethan said. "I do not want to spend days or weeks apart. Adelaide, I want to stay here, make a life here. If Centennial will have me, if you will have me, I can find work, I can make myself useful. I do not need much, just the chance to be near you to see where this leads." "It will lead to marriage if we keep courting," Adelaide said seriously. "This is a small town and I am a respectable schoolteacher. If you stay, if we continue seeing each other, everyone will assume we are heading toward a wedding. And honestly, I would not object to that assumption. I am not interested in a long, ambiguous courtship, Ethan. I am 22 years old and I have been alone long enough. If we are going to do this, I want us to be serious about it." "I have never been more serious about anything in my life," Ethan said fervently. "I want to marry you, Adelaide. I want to build a life with you, support your dreams, be your partner. If you will have me, I would marry you tomorrow." Adelaide laughed, a joyous sound that echoed across the overlook. "Not tomorrow, that is far too fast even for me, but this spring, yes. If we are truly certain this is what we both want, we could marry this spring." They spent the rest of the afternoon on that overlook, talking about the future with an excitement that felt equal parts thrilling and terrifying. Ethan admitted he had perhaps $200 saved from his various jobs, enough to start but not enough to be secure. Adelaide had saved most of her small teacher's salary, living frugally, and she estimated she had about $300. Together they had enough to rent a small house, perhaps buy some land eventually. Ethan was confident he could find work, either at the livery or helping local ranchers or doing carpentry and repairs. The town was growing slowly and always needed skilled labor. They discussed Adelaide's dream of expanding education in the region, and Ethan suggested that perhaps he could help build a larger schoolhouse, fundraise with the ranchers and mining operations nearby who would benefit from a more educated workforce. The more they talked, the more possible it all seemed. Two people pooling their resources and dreams to create something meaningful. When they finally returned to town as the sun was setting, they went directly to the home of Reverend Matthews, the Methodist minister who had conducted the service that morning. He was a youngish man, perhaps 35, with a wife and 2 small children, and he listened with growing delight as Ethan formally asked permission to court Adelaide with the intention of marriage. "I think the courting ship has already sailed," Reverend Matthews said with a knowing smile. "But I am delighted nonetheless. Miss Morgan, you are certain about this young man." "More certain than I have been about anything in years," Adelaide replied, her hand firmly clasped in Ethan's. "Then you have my blessing, and I would be honored to perform the ceremony when the time comes. Might I suggest a reasonable engagement period, however? Allow yourselves time to be sure to prepare properly. These things should not be rushed." "We were thinking late spring," Adelaide said. "Perhaps late April or early May," Reverend Matthews nodded approval. "That seems sensible. It gives the community time to adjust to the idea, and gives you both time to make proper arrangements." As they left the Reverend's house, now officially engaged, Ethan felt as though he was walking on air. Less than 2 weeks ago, he had been mucking stalls in Wilson with no particular future in mind. Now he was engaged to marry the most remarkable woman he had ever met, about to start a life that had real meaning and purpose. The speed of it should have terrified him, but instead it felt absolutely right, as though all the disparate threads of his aimless existence had suddenly woven together into a clear pattern. The next day, Ethan rode back to Wilson to settle his affairs there. Thompson was not entirely surprised when Ethan explained he would not be returning to work at the livery, having seen the determination in the young man's eyes when he first set out to find Adelaide. He paid Ethan what he owed and wished him well. Ethan packed his few belongings, settled his debts, and rode back to Centennial within 2 days, his entire life now contained in saddlebags and focused on one goal: building a future with Adelaide. The town welcomed him with surprising warmth. Word of the engagement had spread quickly, and people seemed genuinely happy that their schoolteacher had found love. Several ranchers offered Ethan work, and he accepted a position with a man named Mr. Garrett, who ran cattle in the hills above town and needed help with spring repairs and preparations for calving season. The pay was fair and the work was hard but honest. Ethan found himself enjoying the physical labor and the camaraderie with the other ranch hands, most of whom were young men like himself trying to build something out of frontier opportunities. He rented a small room in town, maintaining propriety while still being close enough to see Adelaide regularly. Their courtship, though abbreviated by conventional standards, was deeply romantic. They spent every free moment together, talking endlessly, discovering each other's quirks and habits, building the foundation of intimacy that would sustain a marriage. Ethan loved watching Adelaide teach, the patience and creativity she brought to helping each child learn at their own pace. Adelaide loved hearing about Ethan's workdays, the problems solved and lessons learned from experienced ranchers. As March gave way to April, and the landscape exploded into spring bloom, they made concrete plans for their wedding and their life together. Mr. Garrett, who owned several properties in town, offered to rent them a small house at a very reasonable rate, knowing they were newly starting out. It was a simple 2-room structure, but it had a good stove, a solid roof, and room for a garden. Adelaide and some of the town women spent weekends helping to clean and prepare it, sewing curtains and quilts, donating spare furniture. Ethan worked on repairs, fixing the porch, reinforcing the floor, building shelves for Adelaide's growing book collection. They set the wedding date for April 29th, a Saturday that would allow people to travel from neighboring areas without interfering with the work week. Adelaide wrote to Mrs. Pritchard in Lander, the widow who had helped her after her father's death, inviting her to attend. To Adelaide's delight, Mrs. Pritchard wrote back accepting enthusiastically and offering to bring Adelaide's wedding dress, a simple but beautiful gown that had belonged to Mrs. Pritchard's own daughter who had died young. Ethan had no family he wished to invite, but several of the ranch hands he worked with promised to stand up with him, and that felt like family enough. He bought a simple gold band from the jeweler who passed through Centennial monthly, spending more than he should have but wanting Adelaide to have something beautiful. The weeks before the wedding were a blur of activity and anticipation. Ethan found himself constantly amazed that this was his life now, that he had gone from aimless drifter to engaged man with a purpose in the space of 2 months. He knew people in town probably thought they were rushing things, marrying so quickly after meeting, but he did not care. When something was right, it was right, and Adelaide felt like the other half of himself he had not known was missing. They had serious conversations, too, about expectations and fears and what they each needed from marriage. Adelaide was honest about her desire to continue teaching as long as she could, until children made it impractical. Ethan supported this completely, having seen how much her work meant to her. He spoke of his fear of becoming like his father, of letting anger or frustration lead to cruelty. And Adelaide assured him that she had seen nothing but gentleness in him, that she trusted him completely. They talked about children, agreeing they both wanted a family but not immediately, wanting time to establish their life together first. They talked about money and how to manage it, about sharing decisions and responsibilities, about giving each other space while also building shared experiences. These conversations deepened their connection, building trust and understanding that would serve as bedrock for their marriage. Mrs. Pritchard arrived 3 days before the wedding, a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s who embraced Adelaide like a daughter and looked Ethan over with shrewd but kind eyes. "You take good care of her," she said firmly. "Adelaide has been through enough hardship for one young life. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure she is happy," Ethan replied, meaning every word. The day before the wedding, Ethan and Adelaide took one last walk as an unmarried couple up to the overlook where they had first confessed their love. The valley below was green now with new growth, wildflowers painting the hillsides in brilliant colors. They sat on the same rock and looked out over the same view, and Ethan marveled at how much had changed in just 6 weeks. "Are you nervous?" Adelaide asked, her hand in his. "Nervous that I will wake up and discover this was all a dream," Ethan admitted, "but not nervous about marrying you. That is the surest thing I have ever known." "I feel the same," Adelaide said softly. "When I wrote in my diary all those years ago, I hoped that somewhere ahead there was happiness waiting. I had no idea it would come in the form of a cowboy who tracked me down across Wyoming because he read my private thoughts." "Best decision I ever made," Ethan said, kissing her temple. "Finding that diary, reading it, searching for you, best decision of my life." "I am glad you found it," Adelaide said. "I am glad for all of it, even the hard parts that led us to this moment. Everything makes sense now." They stayed on the overlook until sunset, watching the light change across the landscape, neither wanting the day to end, both eager for tomorrow to arrive. The wedding dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect spring mornings that felt like a gift. Adelaide dressed in Mrs. Pritchard's daughter's gown, a simple white creation with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. And when Ethan saw her walking down the aisle of the small church, his breath caught in his throat. She was radiant, glowing with happiness, and he felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. This extraordinary woman had chosen him, had seen something in him worth loving, worth building a life with. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. Reverend Matthews spoke about love and partnership, about the commitment required to build a lasting marriage, about faith and grace carrying them through whatever challenges lay ahead. When it came time for vows, Ethan's voice shook with emotion as he promised to love Adelaide, honor her, stand beside her through all the days of their lives. Adelaide's voice was steady and clear, her gray eyes locked on his as she made the same promises. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, and Ethan kissed Adelaide for the first time as married people, the small church erupted in applause and cheers. They walked back down the aisle together, hands clasped, grinning with pure joy, and emerged into brilliant sunshine and the well wishes of what felt like the entire town. The reception was held in the churchyard, tables laden with food brought by every family in Centennial. There was music and dancing, toasts and laughter, and through it all Ethan kept his wife close, still hardly believing this was real. Adelaide glowed with happiness, thanking everyone for their generosity and support, clearly touched by how thoroughly the community had embraced their union. As the afternoon wore on, people began drifting away to evening chores and homes. Mrs. Pritchard hugged Adelaide tightly before departing, making her promise to write often. Finally, as the sun lowered toward the mountains, Ethan and Adelaide walked hand in hand to their little house, their home, to begin their life together as husband and wife. That night, lying in bed with Adelaide in his arms, Ethan felt a completeness he had never imagined possible. "I love you," he whispered into the darkness. "I will love you every day for the rest of my life." "I love you too," Adelaide murmured, her head on his chest. "Thank you for finding me, Ethan. Thank you for caring enough to look. Thank you for being worth finding," Ethan replied. They drifted to sleep wrapped around each other. Two people who had been lost now firmly found, beginning the greatest adventure of their lives. The first year of marriage was not without challenges. Adjusting to living with another person, to sharing space and decisions and daily life, required patience and compromise from both of them. They had disagreements about money, about how to spend their limited free time, about small domestic matters that felt larger when they were tired or stressed. But they had also promised to communicate honestly, and they worked through every conflict with words rather than silence or anger. Ethan made a conscious effort to be nothing like his father, to be gentle even when frustrated, to listen even when he wanted to argue. Adelaide, used to independence, learned to ask for help rather than shouldering everything alone. Work kept them both busy. Adelaide taught through the end of the school year, and then through the next fall and winter, her small schoolhouse full of eager students. Ethan continued working for Mr. Garrett, gradually taking on more responsibility as he proved himself capable and trustworthy. By late summer, he had saved enough to buy carpentry tools, and he began taking on side jobs building furniture and doing repairs for town residents. His craftsmanship was excellent, and word spread. Soon he had more work than he could easily manage. They settled into rhythms and routines that felt comfortable and right. Breakfast together before work, evenings spent in comfortable silence or lively conversation, Sundays reserved for church and leisure. Adelaide continued reading voraciously and sharing books with Ethan, expanding his education and worldview. Ethan taught Adelaide practical skills like basic carpentry and horse care, things that made frontier life easier. They learned each other's moods and needs, when to give space and when to offer comfort. By their first anniversary in April of 1883, they had saved enough money to seriously consider buying land. Mr. Garrett, nearing retirement, offered to sell them a parcel of his ranch at a good price, 20 acres with water access and good grass. It was more than they had dared hope for, and after long discussions they agreed to take the opportunity. The property came with a small barn but no house, so Ethan began planning and building their home, working every spare moment with help from friends and ranch hands who had become like brothers. Adelaide was 23 now, Ethan 25, and they both felt ready to expand their family. When Adelaide realized she was pregnant in the fall of 1883, they were overjoyed. The pregnancy progressed normally, and Adelaide continued teaching until she became too uncomfortable in her 7th month. The town women rallied around her, sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and preparing her for what lay ahead. Their son was born in May of 1884 on a warm spring night that reminded Ethan of the day they married. Adelaide labored for hours with the midwife and Mrs. Garrett attending her, and when Ethan was finally allowed into the room and saw his wife holding their newborn son, he cried unashamed tears of joy and gratitude. They named him Thomas James, after no one in particular, just names they both liked that felt strong and good. Becoming parents changed them in profound ways. Ethan had not known it was possible to love something as fiercely as he loved this tiny, helpless creature who depended on them completely. He would stand over the cradle watching Thomas sleep, marveling at the perfection of tiny fingers and the miracle of new life. Adelaide bloomed in motherhood despite the exhaustion, finding reserves of patience and tenderness that expanded to encompass their son while still leaving room for Ethan. Money was tighter with Adelaide not teaching, but they managed. Ethan took on extra carpentry work, and Adelaide did sewing and mending from home. By the time Thomas was 6 months old and Adelaide felt ready, she began teaching again, with Mrs. Garrett watching Thomas during school hours. It was not a perfect arrangement, but it worked, and Adelaide was happy to return to the work she loved. The house on their land was finished by the spring of 1885, a sturdy 2-story structure with 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a parlor where Adelaide's books lined shelves Ethan had built specially for them. They moved in on a bright April day, carrying their belongings and their now walking son, and Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. This was theirs, built by his hands, paid for with their work, a home in every sense of the word. Life continued its forward momentum. Thomas grew into a bright, active child with his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair. Adelaide cut her teaching back to part-time, focusing on a small class of older students who needed preparation for secondary education that was not available locally. Ethan's carpentry business thrived, and he hired an apprentice, a young man named Daniel who reminded him of himself a few years earlier, searching for purpose. In 1886, Adelaide became pregnant again, and their daughter was born that winter, a healthy girl they named Clara Rose. Thomas, now 2.5, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. The little house that had seemed so spacious now felt full of life and noise and love. Ethan and Adelaide were constantly exhausted but deeply happy, their days a blur of work and childcare and stolen moments of connection. One evening in the spring of 1887, after both children were finally asleep, Ethan and Adelaide sat on the porch of their house watching the sun set over the mountains. Adelaide leaned against Ethan, his arm around her shoulders, and said, "Do you remember reading my diary for the first time? What you thought when you read it? I remember thinking I had never encountered anyone so honest and brave," Ethan said. "I remember wanting to meet the woman who could turn such pain into such beautiful words. I was so lost when I wrote those entries," Adelaide said quietly. I could not imagine how my life would ever be good again. And now look at us. We have this beautiful home, these beautiful children, this beautiful life. It is more than I dared hope for. We built it together, Ethan said. That is what makes it so good. Not just the things we have, but that we created them as partners. I want to write again, Adelaide said suddenly. Not a diary this time, but maybe stories, essays, things that could be published. I have so much I want to say about this place, this life, the people here. Do you think that is foolish? I think you should write whatever your heart tells you to write, Ethan said firmly. You have the gift for it, Adelaide. Share it with the world. Adelaide did begin writing, carving out time in the evenings after the children slept. She wrote about frontier life from a woman's perspective, about the challenges and beauties of raising a family in wild country, about the strength of community in isolated places. She submitted her pieces to newspapers and magazines in Denver and Cheyenne, and to her delight, several were accepted and published. It was not much money, but it validated her voice and gave her an outlet for her creativity and intelligence. The years rolled forward. Thomas started school, learning his letters from his mother before transferring to the larger school in town. Clara followed 2 years later, a bright child who loved books as much as Adelaide did. Ethan's business continued to grow, and he became known throughout the region for quality work. They added on to the house, a proper study for Adelaide where she could write and teach private students, a workshop for Ethan separate from the barn. In 1889, Adelaide became pregnant again unexpectedly, and their second son was born that fall. They named him Samuel, and he completed their family, a mischievous child who kept them on their toes. With 3 children, life was chaotic and wonderful, the house never quiet, always full of laughter or arguments or the sounds of living. Centennial grew slowly over the years, adding new businesses and families, becoming more connected to the broader territory. Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, and there were celebrations throughout the region. Ethan and Adelaide took their children to watch the parades and festivities, feeling proud to be part of this place that had given them so much. As their 10th anniversary approached in the spring of 1892, Ethan planned a surprise for Adelaide. He arranged for Mrs. Garrett to watch the children for a weekend, and he took Adelaide back to the overlook where they had first declared their love. It was a warm April day, much like their wedding day 10 years before, and the valley spread below them in brilliant spring colors. 10 years, Adelaide said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like forever, in the best way possible. I would marry you again right now if I could, Ethan said. Every single day I am grateful that I found that diary, that I had the courage to track you down. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Adelaide. You and our children and this life we have built. I am grateful too, Adelaide said, tears shining in her eyes. For all of it. For your stubbornness in finding me, for your love, for the family we have created. I love you so much, Ethan Keller. I love you too, Ethan said, pulling her close and kissing her with all the passion and tenderness of a decade of marriage, always and forever. They stayed on that overlook for hours, talking about their years together, the challenges they had overcome, the joys they had shared, the dreams they still had for the future. They talked about watching their children grow, about eventually having grandchildren, about growing old together in the house Ethan had built with his own hands. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, they made their way back down to town. Their children were waiting for them, Samuel running to greet them with Thomas and Clara close behind, and they swept the little ones into hugs and carried them toward home. The house glowed with lamplight in the gathering dusk, warm and welcoming, a beacon of the life they had created together. That night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Ethan took out Adelaide's old diary, the one he had found in a trunk so many years before. He opened it carefully, reading passages aloud to Adelaide, and they marveled together at how much had changed, how the frightened, grieving girl who wrote those words had become this confident, capable woman, how the aimless cowboy who read them had found his purpose. "Should we show this to the children someday?" Adelaide asked. "When they are older, yes," Ethan said. "I want them to know your story, our story, how we found each other. It is a good story, Adelaide, a true love story." "The best kind," Adelaide agreed, snuggling close to him. "Because it is ours." The years continued to pass in the way they do, measured not by calendars but by moments, milestones, memories. Thomas grew tall and serious, showing an aptitude for ranching that pleased Mr. Garrett, who had become like a grandfather to the children. Clara inherited her mother's love of learning and her father's practical skills, equally comfortable with a book or a hammer. Samuel remained the wild one, always getting into scrapes and adventures, keeping his parents on their toes. Adelaide's writing gained recognition beyond the local papers. She published a collection of essays about frontier life in 1894 that sold modestly, but earned praise for its honesty and insight. She began work on a longer manuscript, something between memoir and novel, drawing on her own experiences but fictionalized enough to give her creative freedom. Writing fulfilled something in her that even teaching and motherhood could not, giving voice to observations and feelings that might otherwise have gone unexpressed. Ethan continued his carpentry work, but also became increasingly involved in community leadership. He served on the town council, helped organize the building of a new schoolhouse big enough for multiple teachers, and was instrumental in bringing telegraph service to Centennial. People respected him for his honesty and work ethic, and he found satisfaction in contributing to the place that had given him a home when he needed one most. By the late 1890s, the children were growing into young adults. Thomas, now 15, worked alongside Ethan on carpentry projects and also helped at the Garrett Ranch during busy seasons. Clara, 13, was already being courted by the local schoolteacher to take over some of the younger classes. Samuel, 10, was still more boy than man, but showing signs of the person he would become. The little house that had once seemed so empty now felt perfectly full, generations of love layered into its walls. On a summer evening in 1899, with the children off visiting friends and Adelaide and Ethan alone for a rare, quiet moment, they sat on their porch and watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. They were in their early 40s now, no longer young but not yet old, settled into the comfortable rhythms of long marriage. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had not found my diary?" Adelaide asked. "I try not to," Ethan admitted. "It is too terrible to contemplate. I would still be drifting, probably, working odd jobs and never connecting with anyone or anything. Finding that diary saved me, Adelaide. You saved me." "We saved each other," Adelaide corrected gently. "I was surviving before you found me, but I was not truly living. You gave me partnership, family, love. You helped me build the life I wrote about hoping for in those diary pages." "We are lucky," Ethan said. "Lucky to have found each other, lucky to have built this. Not everyone gets a love story like ours." "No, they do not," Adelaide agreed. "Which is why I am writing it down, so our children and grandchildren will know. So they will understand that love is worth pursuing, worth fighting for, worth building a life around." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands, listening to the night sounds of their land, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods they had planted, the distant call of an owl, the gentle sound of the creek that ran through their property. Everything they saw was something they had worked for, cared for, built with their own hands and hearts. As the years moved into the new century, life continued its forward march. The children began leaving home, pursuing their own dreams and paths. Thomas married a rancher's daughter and settled on land adjacent to his parents, continuing the Keller presence in the region. Clara went east for teacher training and returned to open a girls' academy in Lander, fulfilling a dream inspired by her mother's passion for education. Samuel, true to his adventurous nature, joined the army and wrote letters home from distant postings that thrilled and worried his parents in equal measure. Adelaide and Ethan became grandparents in 1903, when Thomas and his wife had a son, and then again in 1905, when Clara married and had twin daughters. The little ones brought new energy to the house, and Adelaide and Ethan found unexpected joy in this new stage of life, able to spoil and love their grandchildren without the constant responsibility of full-time parenting. Adelaide's book was finally published in 1904, 26 years after she wrote that first diary entry. It was called Wilderness Grace, A Woman's Journey West, and it garnered good reviews and steady sales. Readers responded to Adelaide's honest voice, her unflinching look at hardship balanced with her appreciation for beauty and resilience. She received letters from women across the country thanking her for telling their stories, for giving voice to experiences that too often went unrecorded. Ethan was enormously proud of Adelaide's accomplishment, and he made sure everyone in Centennial and beyond knew about her book. He kept a copy in their parlor where visitors could see it, and he never tired of telling people, "My wife is an author," with undisguised pride in his voice. They celebrated their 20th anniversary in 1902 and their 25th in 1907, each milestone feeling like both an achievement and a beginning. Their love had deepened over the years, moving beyond the passionate intensity of youth into something more comfortable and enduring. They knew each other completely, the good and the difficult, and they had chosen to stay, to build, to love through all of it. On a spring day in 1908, 26 years almost to the day after Ethan had knocked on Adelaide's door in Centennial, they took their annual pilgrimage to the Overlook. It was harder now to make the climb, their bodies showing the wear of hard frontier living, but they persisted because this place mattered to them, held their history. Standing at the viewpoint, looking down at the valley that had become home, Ethan said, "I want to thank you, Adelaide, for saying yes when I showed up out of nowhere with your diary, for taking a chance on me, for building this life with me. You made me better than I ever thought I could be. You gave me everything I wrote about hoping for in that diary," Adelaide replied, tears streaming down her face. "Family, love, purpose, home. You tracked me down across Wyoming and gave me the world. How could I not love you for that? How could I not spend every day grateful for you?" They held each other there on the Overlook as the sun climbed higher, warming the spring day, bringing life back to the land after winter's sleep. Below them, Centennial looked peaceful and prosperous, the schoolhouse Adelaide had taught in still standing, the church where they had married still holding services, the town they had helped build continuing to grow. "We have had a good life," Ethan said. "The best life," Adelaide corrected. "The very best." They stayed on the Overlook until afternoon, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the changes they had seen in the territory turned state, about the world that was changing rapidly with automobiles and electricity, and all the modern advances that seemed to be accelerating each year. But mostly they talked about their own story, the improbable, beautiful story that began with a dusty trunk and a forgotten diary. As they finally made their way back down the trail, moving slowly but steadily, Ethan thought about the young man he had been 26 years ago, lost and directionless, stumbling upon a diary that would change his life. He thought about the courage it had taken to set out searching for a stranger based on nothing but words on a page and a feeling in his heart. He thought about the extraordinary woman who had given him a chance, who had built this beautiful life with him. Walking hand in hand through the wildflowers that carpeted the hillside, Adelaide and Ethan Keller headed home to the house and land and family they had created together. Living proof that love stories, real and true love stories, could be found even in the wildest places if you were brave enough to search and bold enough to believe. Their story would continue for many more years, layers of memory and experience building on that foundation of a found diary and a tracked-down author, and a spring wedding that began it all. And in their home, in a place of honor, that original diary sat on a shelf, pages yellowed now but words still clear, a testament to hope and resilience, and the extraordinary power of love to transform lives and build futures where none seemed possible. Their children would inherit it someday, and their grandchildren, and the story would be passed down through generations. The cowboy who found a diary in an old trunk tracked down the author and married her that spring, beginning a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone.